New courses in Authentically Us, a safe online support space for women new to the LGBTQIA+ community. Maybe I'm Not Straight is a do-it-your-own pace course that examines why it can be so hard to come out. We identify 4 main reasons why coming out is a challenge for many women. In this course, we talk about divorce, deconstructing religious beliefs, internalized homophobia, and more. And for those of you who have unexpectedly found yourselves falling in love with a woman, and if that first lesbian relationship is now over, our course, When the Catalyst Relationship Ends, explores why first lesbian relationships are so impactful, why we fall in love with our catalyst so hard, and why breakups in these relationships are so life-changing. Join either of these courses today and you'll receive your first month subscription at Authentically Us for free. You'll find our courses Maybe I'm Not Straight and When the Catalyst Relationship Ends in Authentically Us. Find Authentically Us at AnneMarieZanzal.com. That's www.AnneMarieZanzal.com. Hey, queer friends and allies. Welcome to Season 6 of Coming Out and Beyond, LGBTQIA+ stories. Here's your host, Anne-Marie Zanzal.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Coming Out and Beyond, LGBTQIA+ stories. I'm very excited to introduce my guest today. Rebecca Wilson is a cultivator of creativity, queer poet, curious observer, and soulful storyteller, uniquely gifted at bringing people together, speaking gently to harsh realities and stirring transformation. When the denomination she faithfully served told her she could not be ordained and openly queer, she chose authenticity. She regularly looks back, not with regret, but rather with a deep desire to journey with others, seeking liberation from the beliefs, institutions, and systems that deny our humanity and bind our spirits. Rebecca and her 10 Camels now travel the country, turning words into water through poetry, sermons, keynote addresses, workshops, and consultations. A sought-after voice for organizations ready to dive into all the things that cause and quench our thirst. Read more of her story in Unraveling, Coming Out and Back Together, a collection of poems that capture her experience of coming out, surrendering her clergy credentials, and releasing the shame that was never hers to carry. Oh, Rebecca, I love that. Releasing the shame that was never hers to carry. Girl, I gotcha.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join you.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear your story. And I see you were a Methodist. So was this pre all the changes in the Methodist Church, or what, were you in a particularly conservative part of Methodism in the United States?
No, I wouldn't say that I was in a particularly liberal or conservative part of the country, but my story started, my coming out was before some of the big changes that happened. I'd like to think that maybe some of my journey influenced other people to make some changes. I don't know, maybe that's a lofty thought, but no, United Methodism before it was even United Methodism runs through my family tree. So at least 5 generations of my family was part of the Methodist John Wesley tradition. So I was born and raised in Flint, Michigan, and I played by the Flint River long before it became infamous because of the water crisis. But my great-grandmother on my mother's side of the family was very Methodist in her beliefs and in her politics. And she had a big influence in my faith, my spirituality. I remember sitting around, and as much as she talked about the Bible, we looked at the hymnal, good old Charles Wesley songs. And so it's hard to talk about my life without talking about the influence of the United Methodist Church.
So okay, so when you say, are you a Wesleyan Methodist or a Wesleyan?
No, United Methodist, but but still, we don't. There's a whole nother world of Wesleyanism, but people that are deeply entrenched in United Methodism talk a lot about John Wesley. He's right up there with Jesus.
And he's really, really, like, the people that are Wesleyans are very conservative. So I was wondering if that was the church you were from or not.
No.
So I would love to hear your story. So tell me your story.
So, like I said, I was born in Flint, Michigan, and my maternal side of the family was mostly Methodist. There were some Lutherans, but they were more quiet about that. My father's family is very Catholic, Irish Catholic, but my parents chose to bring me up in the Methodist Church, which didn't always make my Catholic side of the family happy. But on my third birthday, I was baptized in the United Methodist Church. A particular congregation was a part of my life until it closed when I was in my early 20s.
Okay.
So I was a church kid. I liked going to church. At a very young age, my parents gave me a choice. So you can get up and go to church if you want to, and you don't have to if you don't want to. And I chose to because I
Now,
really liked to be there.
did you have any siblings that chose the opposite?
Yes, yes. And they think that I was just, extremely pious. But really, there was something about church that drew me in.
I
And
understand.
I loved Sunday school. My home life was pretty dysfunctional and chaotic. And so church was a place where I found peace, where I found belonging. It was a way to keep myself out of trouble in my teenage years.
Well, that's exactly how I just have come to realize my attachment to the church. So I was raised Catholic and my home life was very dysfunctional. So the church and school provided me with a structure that children crave. And I knew what the rules were there. And also when I would go to church, the same thing happened every single time. So I was never surprised or caught off guard or just so confused about what was going on. So church provided me a place of acceptance. I excelled at church. And so I get it. It was just the place that it was better than getting in trouble. And so I really liked that. And hence probably where I ended up in ministry.
I was really a curious kid. I mean, I'm a curious adult, but I asked a lot of questions and I was really, I don't know if I want to say the word blessed, but fortunate. I had some really amazing Sunday school teachers that were a part of my life and my faith, and they encouraged my questions. And as much as they could, they tried to answer them. Even as a kid, I was asking a lot of questions about, hey, wait a minute, about this Trinity thing. How is God the Father and the Son? And yeah, yeah. And then being a storyteller kid, I would hear these stories at church, and then I would go home, and during the week, I would try to figure out where my own life and my own story fit in this bigger story. And so a lot of the stories that I wrote, even as a kid, had some connection to something that I heard on a Sunday that just caught my attention.
Can you give me an example of one off the top of your head?
Well, I remember that we had a minister who gave a sermon about Johnny Appleseed and
Mhm.
somehow connected that to the Garden of Eden. I don't remember all of that, but I remember during church on the back of a prayer card, drawing a picture of a guy in a hat sitting under a tree with a bushel of apples. And then I went home and I wrote this story, or drew scenes from this story of me and Johnny Appleseed and Jesus and Adam and Eve in the garden talking to God.
I'm just going to say most kids don't do that, but
Yeah.
there are some kids that do. There's
Yeah.
just, when they came out with the multiple intelligences years ago, there were 7. And then as time went on, they began to add some more. And one of them is the spiritual awareness, that some people are just more bent towards spiritual awareness. And I do think that's where I fall. You're just sort of more aware of all of those things than other people are.
And I've tried not to be. There's times in my life I'd rather not think about these things, but it's just I've accepted that it's a part of who I am and how my brain and my heart works and how I process things. And so life's a lot easier when you just accept those things about yourself rather than trying to change them.
Hmm. So
Yeah.
you got through high school. Did you go to college for religion at all,
No,
or?
so my life after high school was very out of the box. So I struggled with depression from the time that I was probably even a kid, but definitely throughout junior high and high school. And when I graduated from high school, the depression became, much more serious and, messed with my day-to-day functioning. And so right after high school, I took 2 classes at a community college. But it was 11 years after high school that I finally finished an associate's degree at a community college. But then I was on the fast tracks. Then shortly after that, I had my associate's degree, and then within the next 2 years, I had completed a Bachelor of Arts in Hispanic Studies, and then 6 months after that, I was off in seminary. So it took me a while to get going with school, but once I did, it was pretty fast.
Where'd you go to seminary?
Here at Evangelical in Evanston, Illinois. It's on Northwestern's campus.
Okay. Okay. Got it.
Yeah,
Got it. Got it. Yeah. So
yeah.
you went to an evangelical seminary.
Well, the Evangelical is in the name, but it's one of the officially approved United Methodist seminaries. Yeah.
All right. Because there's also Asbury, right?
Yes, and Asbury and Garrett would be on very different ends of the spectrum.
Asbury is in Kentucky, I think,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And it's the more conservative one. And
Yeah.
then, so you, well, yeah, if you're at the University of Chicago, obviously you're going to be at a more liberal part of Christianity.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
not all of the students, and I mean, there was a spectrum of professors and students, but overall, Garrett, I would say, is a progressive and liberal. And there's a large amount of LGBTQ seminarians there.
Yeah, I went to Yale Divinity School and similar, very similar. And I went when I was like in my 40s. It was a very interesting experience. Wasn't my best educational experience I've ever had, but it was a really, I mean, it was just an interesting I don't want to take your time but talking about it, but it was very antiquated in the way they educated adults.
Mm.
And I felt like I had come from Hartford Seminary and I had had a cooperative MDiv. And you know, when I was at Yale, you had to go 3 days a week to take Old Testament on Monday, Wednesday, Friday for an hour. And it was like, this is ridiculous because when I was at Hartford Seminary, I would go for 3 hours and, you know, and so it was very just interesting. And I found them the school to be very dismissive of older female students, not so much the men, but the older female students. So it was an interesting experience. So, how was your experience in seminary?
I love seminary. I mean, the intellectual part of me being able to sort of put my brain and my heart together and learn all this stuff, I absolutely loved it. And I actually thought about as I was navigating, my own sexuality and my call to ministry, there was a part of me that thought, I just want to stay in seminary forever and get a PhD and teach and, do all of that. But I was again, sort of my first year of seminary, I lived on campus and was right there. And then partly for financial reasons and partly just the pressures of all that life, I came back and did like a commuting world for my second 2 years of seminary. And so I did intensive courses in January and over the summer. One semester, I took the mega bus down once a week from Detroit to Chicago to finish because I was also serving at a church here in the Detroit area. So, but I loved it.
I think for me too, as a commuter, I think you miss a lot of I was commuting and I had 4 kids between the ages of 2
Wow.
and 14.
Wow. I
It was
just had
just,
me and I could hardly do it.
yeah, it was challenging. So when you were in seminary,
Mhm.
were you in the ordination track at that time?
Yeah, so,
Were you out at that time?
no, that's an interesting question, and the answer depends, I think, on the day. So I knew when I was a kid, a quirky kid in Flint, that there was something that was different about me. I fell in love with the girl for the first time when I was 19, tried to come out to my family probably in my early 20s. It did not go well at all. And so I just sort of put my whole self back in the closet. I hadn't even fully come out and just went back in. And then as I was my life was difficult enough without adding, being lesbian on top of that and all that went along with it. And so I had kind of convinced myself that, yeah, this is me, but I can just not accept it. Like, it's a weird thing. Like, I wasn't actively denying it, but I didn't accept it either. I was always afraid that the few people that knew would like pop out of the woodworks and tell people. But when I went to seminary, I didn't even think of myself as in the closet. I just had taught myself to not even think about that part of who I was.
I haven't dated in decades. I have no idea what I'm doing. I've never dated women before, but I'm excited and also terrified. Ugh, I always seem to pick the wrong women to date. What am I doing wrong? Do any of these sentiments sound like you? Listen, dating, especially if you're new to the queer community or if you're coming out of a long-term relationship, can be daunting. I know, I've been there. Let me help you. Hi, I'm Barbara, and I'm the coach and expert behind Lavender Dating. I work with clients to help them overcome their biggest mental blocks when it comes to dating in the queer community. If you need to find the courage to start dating again, or need help to spot patterns in your behaviors, or partner choices that maybe haven't worked out that well for you so far, then I am here to help you. Download our free dating readiness assessment guide and book a free call with me. We can talk about getting you the support you need. Visit lavenderdating.com. That's www.lavenderdating.com.
So when you saw all the other LGBTQ people there, what was that like for you?
It was a mix of emotions. I mean, and there was part of me that was like sort of jealous and envious. And some of them, they came from parts of the country where it was okay, like you could possibly be ordained and be out as gay or lesbian. And I just like, there was a part of me that's like, I want to do that. I remember they had like a queer student club that was showing a film. I don't even remember what film it was. And I wanted to go, but I freaked myself out. Like, you can't go because why would you be going there if you weren't lesbian? And you don't want people to know this. There's people from my home annual conference that I know are not on the inclusive side of things. And so it was really weird. And I think part of coming back and being a commuter student was not completely about that, but it was like, it was tempting to be around all these out people, and to want to join them.
So you put yourself further back into the closet.
I did.
So what happened after that?
So I finished seminary. I graduated from seminary in May of 2014. And on a Friday, I graduated. And then Saturday morning, got up and drove back to Michigan. My annual conference, which is how Methodist churches are sort of grouped together, was having their annual meeting. And I was commissioned as a provisional clergy person at that annual conference. So the United Methodist Church, it's 2 steps. Commissioning is provisional ordination. You have the title and all the rights and responsibilities. And then you go through 3 more years of examination and testing and stuff. So I was commissioned in 2014 and then received my first appointment where I served in a district level position. So there were like 100, at the time I started, there were just about 100 United Methodist churches in the Detroit area district. And so I served at the district level and did that faithfully for almost the whole 3 years. And but as it was getting closer and closer to go before the Board of Ordained Ministry for full ordination examination, I was becoming less and less okay with living in the closet. And I just thought, if I let a bishop lay hands on me and ordain me, I will never, ever come out. And I want to come out. I don't want to do this. And at that time, Michigan was not a place where you could be. I mean, there are LGBT clergy here, but they're not out, or they're out in very selective ways.
What changed?
For me?
Yeah, what changed from the girl in seminary that was like, okay, I can't go to this movie because people might think I'm gay, to being someone who said, if I get ordained, I will not come out. So, and that doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah. So during that time, those years of doing my provisional ministry, I ended up, it wasn't in my job description, but I became very involved in a disaster response project. There was a massive flood. At the same time that I started this appointment, there was this big flood that hit the Detroit area. Like 140-some thousand households were affected. And I became in charge of this disaster response project. And as I was going in and out of houses with flooded basements and mold and asbestos and no working heat, I was being this voice of compassion for other people. I was advocating at the local and the state and the national level for resources, for help, like saying this is a problem and it needs to be addressed. And I had this moment where it was like, I've never offered myself anywhere near this level of compassion. I've never advocated for myself on anything. And that was the beginning of it was in moldy basements that I made the decision that I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life in a closet.
Well, in the later in life community, I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but we call it a catalyst. So a catalyst can be a human, it can be a woman that you fall in love with. It can be somebody that may know you're in love with her, somebody that may not know you're in love with her. It may be somebody you have a physical relationship. You may not have a physical relationship, or maybe even be a movie star or something like that makes you realize that, oh, maybe I'm not as straight as I thought I was. But there's also another catalyst, and that's a major life event. So for example, like a lot of times, an illness, a divorce, a disaster, something like that all of a sudden makes you, and it sounds exactly what I always talk about, like you're going in and out of these dusty, dirty basements and, with all the mold and the asbestos and everything like that, and being so nice and kind to people. And you're like, wait a minute, why am I not doing that for me? And part of your compassion was being compassionate to yourself, to say, you know what, Rebecca, you gotta come straight about this.
Right. So I had been working with a therapist throughout, even while I was in seminary, I was seeing a therapist. And so for the first probably year or so that we met, we never talked about sexuality. I was very careful to not let that come up. And then it slowly started to come out, but I was very selective in what I did and didn't talk about. But at the same time that I was in and out of, I would leave a basement and then I would go to a therapy appointment. And so that's really where I've said for the first time out loud, like, what if I treated myself like I'm treating these flood survivors? But then it quickly went into, but the political, the religious Methodist implications of this, because I knew at the time where the conference was at, that they were not, that if I want, I could be, they had this rule that you could be self-avowed and unpracticing. So you could say this is who you are, but you had to declare that you weren't practicing that. And I knew that I was not going to get it. I knew people that had been involved in that. And for me, it was like, that's not a game that I am willing to
It's
play.
also cruel. Honestly, it is
Yeah.
cruel to make people be celibate their whole lives for who they are. It also denies them relationship and companionship and family. I mean, it's so cruel and so stupid. And some denominations do it. And I'm sure like parts of the global Methodist Church probably still, did they even do something like that? Probably.
No, I mean, there is the new denomination called the Global Methodist Church, and you couldn't even be self-avowed there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So you realize that, okay, I'm not gonna live as a celibate, which I actually just did another podcast interview with somebody who came from the evangelical church this morning, and he was a non-denominational and he had been celibate till he was 34, and because of the church, and nobody knew he was gay. He did it to himself, so I understand. So you're trying to navigate all these. Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
Could you move to another more affirming area to be
Well,
ordained?
as I'm realizing that like I need to make a decision. So I did talk to a few people to kind of test the waters of where people were at. I knew that things were getting better, but it was at a very slow pace. And so I'm talking to all these people, and what I'm getting is, you got to wait. Like, we're not there yet. You got to put yourself on hold. So just go ahead and let us ordain you, because there was no question that they were going to approve me for ordination. And then just, wait until it's safer to come out later, or just put your ordination on hold. You can continue your provisional period a little longer. But that wasn't feeling right either. So a lot of stuff happened. But even when I finally did send this letter to all of the people that I needed to tell, I got several people that said, well, why don't you just move out west? The Western jurisdiction has historically been more progressive. And what I said to them at that time was, my calling has always been very specific to place, to the city, to Flint, to Detroit. This is my life. This is my home. And now the church that's been my life and my home is saying, yeah, we're not willing to take a stand for you here, but just go out west. And so that, to me, that didn't feel right either. Also, there's only a lot of people that I have met on this journey have been told by their own bishops and their own annual conferences, well, just move somewhere else where they will accept you, because, we're not going to take that stand.
Yeah. My friend Alex Soto,
I do know him.
Alex?
Yes.
Yeah, Alex. He actually, so we went to Yale together. He was a year behind me. And then when he served in New Milford, Connecticut for a while, and I lived in the next town over.
Okay.
So I ended up running into Alex a lot, and so that whole saga of the Methodist Church and trying to get people. So you decided that you didn't want to do that. You wanted to stay where you were called, to your home, to Flint, Detroit, and they said,
when I actually met with the bishop, one of the things that he said to me was, well, if and when things ever change, give me a call. I'd be happy to welcome you back. And that was, there were lots of things along the way where I thought, well, maybe I could stay and maybe I could do this or do that. But there were also like several moments along the way where I realized this system is killing me. One of those key moments, maybe like a catalyst, was, so in June of 2016 was when the Pulse nightclub shooting happened. So that was during the Michigan, when all of the Methodists in Michigan were gathering for their annual conference. And so I was slowly starting to out myself. I kept a little list in my phone. It had like 3 people on it. And at that conference, I told the 4th person, and that was on like Saturday after dinner time. And in talking to her, she tried to give me some hope that maybe I could be out and not have to leave, that maybe if I could just be patient, we could navigate it. And I trusted her and thought maybe. Well, then I woke up the next morning to news of the Pulse shooting, and that was just really heavy, as it is for so many people. And then I get back on the floor where we're doing all this church business, and one of the things they were voting on was whether or not to take a stance on gun control. And I was a part of presenting this resolution, and it did not pass. People got up and everybody, we got to protect our guns and our rights to have guns. And then the bishop, a different bishop than when I was coming out, announced about what had happened in Orlando and asked us to pray. And there were people who didn't even want to pray for people who'd been massacred.
Right.
Yes, in a nightclub. And then it was like, well, let's have a conversation as a group about homosexuality. And so we were invited to turn to our neighbor. And there were a couple of prompt questions. And I just remember that the person that was sitting next to me was the wife of a high profile person. And she said to me, I don't talk about those things. And that's when I remember just thinking,
what am I doing here?
sitting in my chair and thinking, there's so many reasons that I don't want to be here that are so much more than about who I am. But it was just like all of this. It was like, and it was this real grief of, I have given my whole life to this church. This church gave me a life in some ways, but it's also taken so much more from me that can ever give back. And that was it. That was when I knew, it's just a matter of figuring out the timeline so I can try to finish up more basements and then get out of here without losing what was left of my dignity and humanity.
Well, a lot of times, they call them microaggressions. And as somebody who is closeted and not fully out yet, you kept receiving these microaggressions again and again and again. And then I'm going to say this in the name of your 10 camels. It's the straw that broke the camel's back. It was and you're like, I'm done. I'm out of here. I had that moment when I left the Catholic Church. It was during the 90s, and it was when all the things were going on with the priests and all that stuff like that. And I was dragging my kids to CCD, which they hated, and I'm like, there's got to be a better way, because I did want them to go to church. And my daughter and I were going up to communion. And when we got up to communion, she was 8 at the time. The priest yelled at her because she wasn't holding her hands right. So she's an oldest daughter. So my perfectionist older daughter is walking back. And if you can't see this, I'm moving my hands back and forth. When she's walking back, going like that. And I leaned down to her and I said, don't listen to him. He's an ass. And which I'm glad I did said that, because I'm like, that's it. And that was the moment. I mean, it was just here I am bringing my children to this church to be raised by the faith. Don't you yell at my kid on how they're gonna, I wouldn't do it for myself, but for my kid, I did it. And that's when we started looking at other churches. So I understand sometimes it's just the thing that you're ready to leave, but something just tips it over. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what was it like when you left? I'm sure it must have been first of all, you've been planning this in your life. You're in your mid-30s, you're planning this in your life. And all of a sudden you're I'm sure a lot of us who come out later in life, and how I define later in life, I say it's self-defined. So my youngest clients are 25 and my oldest are way over 70. So, so people define later in life by their own terms. It's like pizza, it's a good pizza or not. That's self-defined too. It's subjective. And the thing is that, here you are, you're 35 years old or so, about that. And you had planned to give your whole life to this church and be a pastor. And I'm sure you were so excited about that time in your life, because I remember those things too. And then they're like, we're not going to ordain you.
And unless you're willing to deny yourself. And it was no. So yeah, it was, so that fall, so that was in June when everything happened at annual conference. And then it was in November. It was the first Sunday of Advent, which that year was the last Sunday of November. And I sent an email with a letter that went to the bishop and all of the appropriate people, and to my direct supervisor and the people on the board of ordained ministry, and saying I am not submitting my ordination paperwork. I'm submitting this letter instead. And I talked about my life, about how the United Methodist Church had been a part of it, about growing up in Flint, in Detroit. I talked about flood survivors. I tied it to the theme of waiting, as it was Advent. And then I said, this is who I am, and this is what I'm doing. I'm leaving. I'm surrendering my provisional credentials because I'm not waiting any longer, and because I'm not playing this game, and I deserve more than this, and so do other people. And so probably about a week or so after that, I met with the bishop. I had not met him before. He was new. And that was where he said basically, even though he would categorize himself as a progressive liberal rainbow guy, he said to me that, if things change, I'll welcome you back. Give me a call. That was pretty much it.
He's like, I'm not doing anything for you. I'm not going to do plant my flag on this hill.
Yeah, it was not time for it. And I've done a lot of processing and healing, but there were also people who, particularly in the liberal and progressive circles, who knew me and knew my work and were really, I was very careful about when I told them. They wanted me to be the poster child. They were like, you would be the perfect first person, not the first lesbian, but the first out publicly, this is who I am. And they wanted to use me for their cause. And I also knew that I didn't want to be used that way either. And so for me, that was the hardest part. I think the more liberal, progressive rainbow people who, when I said I wasn't going to be their poster child, to this day, many of them still don't speak to me. And so I had to navigate. So there was two parts, right? There was my credentials that they knew I was going to surrender, but there was also the work and the ministry that I was doing with this flood recovery project. And we had this huge grant. So I was trying to help as many people as possible. The goal was to shut the project down at the end of January. So to do as much, spend all the money because it wasn't, it needed to be used. And so it was a tight rope for me to navigate. But from that time that I went to the bishop's office in early December, until I surrendered my credentials at the end of February, I was pretty much an outcast. I couldn't get people to speak to me. I would reach out to ask questions about the technical aspects of what I was doing. I got nothing. And so I finished up the project, made sure my staff got paid at the end of January. And then from the end of January until the end of February, when I surrendered my credentials, the only communication I had was with the bishop and his assistant. They encouraged me, several people encouraged me to just leave my credentials on the desk at the end of the day with my keys. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'm not doing that. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm not doing that. So in the end, I fought really hard and I got 30 minutes at the end of the workday with the bishop and with some of his cabinet members. And I gave them, and I brought a few people along. They were terrified that I was going to bring news crews and cameras, even though I told them that's not who I am. That's not what I wanted to do, but they were afraid of that. But with the small group of people, I gave my credentials back. Mm-hmm. And it was, at the time, it felt like the most humiliating, shameful moment of my life. There was no, the people that came specifically that I brought with me were supportive, but the bishop and the cabinet, there was nothing. There was no compassion. There was no recognition of what a hard, painful decision this was.
Sorry, Rebecca. I've had my struggles with the church, so I completely understand. It is so important, and then to just be discarded like your work and your personhood and your membership of this church didn't matter is shitty.
Oh yeah. So after that day, I was in a wilderness. That was February. I felt like I was in a horrible wilderness for pretty much the whole rest of that year.
Well, you're probably like, what am I going to do next?
Yeah.
You have great disaster relief training. So you could have gone into a nonprofit.
Yeah. So fortunately, I was in a position where I had a little bit of money in the bank and I could just focus on healing, and I was going to therapy every week, sometimes twice. Mm-hmm. People that had been a part of my life were like, hey, like, come stay with me for a week here and stay with me for a week there. So that's,
Did you reach out? So we came out at about the same time. Mm-hmm. Did you reach out into any of the later in life communities that were like available on like that?
I didn't know a lot of resources that were out there.
It has been my life work since coming out because I Googled, it took me 10 years to come out. I Googled later in life lesbian, and in 2016, I found a support group of women coming out later in life on Facebook. And that changed everything for me because I had community. I had a group of women that were talking about the things they were saying when I first went into the group. I was like, of course, you always think you're the only one, right? And so I'm like, oh my God, like I have never heard other women talk like this before. And it was honestly the most life-changing thing for me. So now that's why I focus on building communities.
Yeah. Well, it's so important so that people like me, know that there's stuff out there. But I did a lot of healing. I did a lot of course, writing. about that. And then, so another part of the story. So after being away from the church for well over a year, a reconciling congregation, which is like an open and affirming church in the Methodist world that I've had a relationship with for a long time, invited me to consider being on their staff. So in a full-time position, I had some questions, some wonders, but it was a full-time job with healthcare. I hadn't had healthcare in a while. And so I took it. And, things were going well, good, okay. And then St. Louis happened. That was the general conference in 2019 where the Methodists voted like against love. And I was there and my face went viral in the New York Times and all over the AP press. And
I'll have to look that up.
that set off a shitstorm in my own life of just my own internal stuff. It brought people from my family that are not really a part of my life anymore were reaching out to me. I got hate mail to my house and death threats by email. I mean, it was horrible. And
Well, for somebody who's newly out, like when you're an old gay, you sort of like even now I feel like a much older gay than I was 10 years ago, but when you're an old gay, you sort of can roll with the punches with that. But as a newly out gay, how horrible.
yeah. And I got and back here in Michigan, there was no nothing. So that fall, I had long thought about just leaving Michigan for a while. I'm of my own decision, not so I could get some other conference to take me. So I moved to Florida and I lived there for about 3.5 years. And while I was in Florida, I was not looking for church, religion, spirituality. Actually had a decent job with the county, county jobs, good money, good benefits, good time off. I was ready to roll with that. And then the pandemic happened. And so I found myself, I was in my probationary period when the pandemic hit. So I wasn't eligible to work from home.
Mhm.
And so that position just kind of got put on hold. But at the same time that this was happening, I found my way to metropolitan community churches.
Mhm.
And there was a small little, I didn't even know it was a church, but it was a metropolitan community church. And I found my way there and met the most amazing lesbian pastors and queer people. And they really took me in. And I ended up working for the MCC denomination for a few years while I was there. But really, what that experience did for me, that was the first time in my life that I was completely immersed in queer
In queer
community,
culture.
where
Yeah.
being me was like the norm. Like if you were straight, you were on the outs.
And MCCs also have a little bit of an evangelical bent to them because
Mhm.
a lot of the people that go to MCCs are typically from like Southern Baptist, Pentecostal, Church of Christ. So they have, honestly, sometimes they have a lot to work through, more than people that were raised in progressive Christianity.
Yes. The congregation that I was attending actually they had people there that had come from the Baptist world and more even, but they had a lot of people that used to be Catholic and a lot of United Methodists. So for me, there was a liturgical feel to their worship that was really important to me. And actually their senior pastor had come from the United Methodist world long, long time ago. So it was a beautiful experience for me that I'm so grateful for. And then, so that was really where I found healing is an ongoing process. But
Right.
if there's like a real moment when healing shifted from like, this is something that I want to something that's actually happening, it was while I was in Florida and part of MCC churches. And that's where I decided that I was ready to tell my story that the Methodists told me I couldn't tell. And I published my book of poems about that whole experience.
So tell me about the poems you wrote.
Yeah, so it's the book is called Unraveling, Coming Out and Back Together. It's 21 poems. Well, I say 21 poems. There's a sermon in there. There's also in there the letter that I sent to the bishop and also what I shared with them when I actually was handing back my credentials, but still poetic. And so the pieces are arranged by liturgical season because I'm still very liturgical like that. But really, it was just me. I never got to tell my story. Is certainly not all of it. But this was the parts about what prompted me. One of the first poems is about Pulse, the nightclub shooting, but about my own pulse and about how I was ready to breathe differently.
So, all right, I'm going to share it with you. Pulse is very, very pivotal in my own story, too, because the next Sunday I had to preach. So it happened on a Sunday, and I remember being just horrified. And so I talked about gay bars being sanctuaries. and how that's where gay people could gather and be themselves. And so the next Sunday, at a very liberal progressive church in Connecticut, I preached about what would it be like if we made church a sanctuary for gay people. And so that's what I preached. So this was the year I was like coming out. So it was 2016. And then like 4 weeks later, I had to go preach at the neighboring town. And so I would recycle the sermon, and somebody got up and walked out because I said something about gun control. Somebody got up, and afterwards I had this horrible feeling, like this just absolutely horrible feeling. And I realized it was because I was preaching it as an ally, and I wasn't an ally. And that was the last time I ever preached a sermon as an ally.
Wow.
That was it. And so Pulse, uh, it moved my journey along because I was absolutely horrified about what happened. And so I have that connection with you where I realized that, I couldn't live as just an ally anymore. I had to be out. So it was one of the most pivotal moments of my life.
I think it was the Sunday after Pulse, or maybe 2 weeks after. A church that I was connected to, they asked me if I would be a part of the service that week. And they did a special litany for all of the people who were killed.
You in Orlando?
No, I was in Detroit at this time.
Oh, okay.
But
So you left.
Yeah, I wasn't. And so they were asking, I didn't go to Florida till 2019, but a church in Detroit asked me if I would read these names as part of the service. And when that service was over, I sobbed like I have never sobbed. And I'm pretty good in times of sickness and death and but reading those names, it felt different because it was like, I felt like this could be me. Like, I mean, here I am again denying myself. These are not just names of people that were killed. Like, I've been in clubs and bars before, and I'm terrified of anybody knowing that. So again, it was that experience of reading off the names that was like, I can't continue to deny this
Anymore.
Yeah, and I'm not going to.
I wonder how many people, because of
Yeah.
Pulse, I can't do this anymore,
I mean, I imagine it pushed some people further into the closet of fear, but I think there are other people that it probably
You know what I've learned? So I've been really concerned about like what's going to happen with my business. I'm like, are people going to not, because of everything that's going on in this country right now? Guess what, Rebecca? People are going to be gay no matter what. They're going to come out. I mean, like our ancestors, the ones that were super brave, came out in the 50s and 60s and just lived their lives. So people aren't going to stop being gay because people are mean and cruel. They're not. Maybe it'll decrease people that will be actively out, but people will still come out and maybe keep it more quiet. So we both have had enormous privilege in coming out in a time where it's much more accepting than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago, 40 years ago. Yeah. So you published your book of poetry, and the first one was Pulse. And I can understand how you have a pulse and stuff like that. So tell me a little bit more about your book.
Well, after that experience of surrendering my credentials, I literally unraveled my clergy robe. I left it out in the backyard, it rained several times. So it was like wet and heavy and nasty. And then I put it, for some reason, there was a red plastic trash can in the backyard that had filled with rain and muddy water. So then I put the robe in there and I just let it sit, and it dried out, but it smelled. It was horrible. And then one day I went out there with a pair of not even quilting scissors, just funky scissors, and started cutting it up and tearing it up. And then it got into small pieces, and then I ripped it little by little, but by hand. And then I kept one little piece and I took the rest of it to the dumpster. So the reason that it's called unraveling is from that process. And that was a really therapeutic thing for me to do. So it's
very embodied.
Yeah. So the poems of unraveling are about the unraveling of a clergy robe, the unraveling of a calling. But like you shared in the intro, for me, it's really about unraveling shame that I had carried my whole life about who I am and the experiences that I've had. And it's a weird thing to hold in tension that in some ways the church gave me the courage to unravel, but also the church is something that I'm still unraveling today.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that'll be a lifetime's work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it was also a realization. I think I had been holding on to these poems for a long time, wondering if I would ever really publish them. Maybe I'd just put them together in a book myself and hand them out. But I found a really great publisher. That's another amazing story. But a part of it was realizing that I thought I was waiting for permission. I was waiting for somebody in the United Methodist world to say, "Hey, Rebecca, we're ready to hear your story." And I realized that that's probably not ever going to happen, but I wanted to tell my story and I was going to do it. And I didn't need anybody's permission but my own.
I am so excited to read your poems. I'm going to go and buy a copy of it because I'm having a conference coming up in Women's Week in Provincetown. And so I'm thinking, ooh, that would be a good gift
Nice.
for my attendees, because I have my own book. It's called
Mm.
Authentic Peace, and it talks about my own coming out journey, and it's play on the word peace because I always felt like I had a missing piece, Piece, and so the name of the book is Authentic Peace. So what is 10 Camels? Now I see that that's your email address. So tell
Yes,
me.
yes. So 10 Camels. So while I was in Florida, so my Florida life, I was in Florida various times before I actually moved there. And so before 2 years before I moved to Florida, after I had surrendered my credentials and was just kind of lost, I had an opportunity to go spend 2 weeks on the beach to just kind of get myself together, relax, enjoy the water. And my therapist at the time, she knew that I was like, I love stories. I was trying to figure out my own name. Like I had for a lot of my life, I went by Becky, not Rebecca, but I was ready to really claim Rebecca. So she said to me, while you're away, would you like a little bit of therapy homework? Yeah, I was a good student. So I said, yeah. And so she said, why don't you read about Rebecca in the book of Genesis? Just read
Mhm.
what's there, see what comes. Okay. So I had read the story of, yeah.
Did you go to a Christian counselor that was queer affirming?
Yes, she was a United Methodist minister and she worked at a quasi, not everybody there, but she was a Christian counselor, but she was a very liberal and progressive, radical United Methodist minister.
We need to talk about that afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay. Now
So she had been a part of this journey with me. And so she encouraged me to read this. So I'm on the beach and I'm reading about Rebecca, and I had never noticed, not that I remembered, that, there's some problems with this story, but, Abraham sends somebody out to find a wife for Isaac. And so this guy's out at the well and he knows that Rebecca's the one because she doesn't just give him water. She gives water to all 10 of his camels. So after I read that, I couldn't get this vision of camels and water out of my head. I was walking on the beach thinking about camels. I was swimming in the ocean thinking about camels. I was in the pool thinking about camels. But I was also like thinking about, what does ministry look like for me now? What am I doing with my life and my gifts and my calling? And water's always been a thing for me. And
Mhm.
so that the camels started to grow that day. It took several years for them to come to fruition and come to life, but 10 Camels is what I'm doing today. I don't always call it a ministry, but it's my offering to the world. I'm turning words into water. I'm traveling around. I do guest preaching. I do poetry shows. I do workshops. I'm looking to get into more consulting type stuff with churches that are trying to figure out how to be an offering of water to thirsty people, but also to sort of look at the ways that they're making people thirsty.
Mhm.
So that's what 10 Camels is.
Well, that's really exciting. It's
Yeah.
and I get it because, I had served as a chaplain for like 10 years before I came out. And I had been a hospice chaplain for years. And so like what I could call it now, although I never call it a ministry, it is ministry. It's what I do. It's like I help people to reclaim themselves. And it's interesting because like 80% of my clients come from some sort of conservative religious tradition. I love what you said in the beginning at the end of your bio about shame that you didn't earn or whatever.
Wasn't
Like
mine to carry.
wasn't yours to carry. And I really, really love that. I'm currently working with a minister that would probably she really needs to hear that. And so I'm really, really grateful for you saying that. So I'm curious, do you have a partner or are you
I
dating?
I do not have a partner. Dating has been an interesting journey these last few years. Partly, I thought, oh, when I moved to Florida, like I said, but most of my time in Florida was overshadowed by the pandemic. So that made everything more weird and hard. I've dated a little bit, and I don't know, that's one of those areas of my life that I think I want to be more active in that rather than just sitting around twiddling my thumbs thinking that somebody's going to come knocking on my door. But I haven't really dove in yet.
What I'm going to say to you, my wife and I say to our friend, honey, a lesbian's not going to fall for the ceiling and land on your lap. And my wife, who's an old dyke, and she calls herself that, she goes, dating's a numbers game. You just have to put yourself out there and meet as many people as you possibly can. So my co-coach does something called lavender dating. So maybe I should put you in
Yeah,
charge.
because I will say I've had some wild dating experiences. The online world has been wild for me. I haven't, yeah,
It's
it's
it's challenging. It's really and especially for people, a lot of the women I work with have been married, and so and oftentimes they marry like the first man they're ever with too. So their experiences in dating is not there. And also too, Rebecca, we're acculturated, especially in the straight world, to date to marry. And you know what? You can date just to have fun.
yes, thank you for that reminder because I'm not necessarily looking to get married, but I'd like to just have some fun.
That's the thing is when you decide, oh, I'm just going to have fun, that's when you meet somebody that you fall in love
Right,
with.
right, right.
Did you have a coming out song?
I was thinking about that, and I think that, well, I know my song is Culture Club. It's a miracle. When I was a kid, I was absolutely fascinated with Boy George.
Yeah, of
And
course.
so this would have been like the early 80s, early mid 80s. And it was such a big deal. Like, I had lots of grandparents in my world, and it was so wrong for me to even like Boy George. I was Boy George one year for Halloween. My grandma freaked out, like flipped her lid. And so I think the thing about Boy George for me was like the ambiguity of like, wait a minute, he's wearing makeup and the braids in his hair and all of that. And so when I thought about me coming out, that's the song, that's my song, because it's like all that
And then,
stuff that people told me was wrong and bad. No, this is me, and I loved Boy George.
well, and it's so funny because I remember Boy George, and I was like a teenager then. I remember, like, it's so radical what he did. Like, it is so. I don't know if he goes by he pronouns. He may use they now, or she. But what Boy George did was so radical. Showing up as a trans person or a non-binary person, I don't know how they identify in 19, or maybe they don't identify either one of those, but it's like in 1980 something, like how radical that was. And so many people I've talked to talk about Boy George and how, and his ministry
Yeah.
was him showing up. So that's really, really cool. How about a book or a movie that really
Hmm.
changed your perspective on life?
So I write every week on Substack, and this week today I wrote about Goonies, and it's silly in some ways, but the Goonies came out when I was like 6, 7 years old, and
Mhm.
that has been it's at the top, like my top 3 of all movies. And I think it's because they were misfits. They were what
Mhm.
everybody else cast off as rejects. And that's what I loved about them as a kid. I was a kid that was quirky, awkward, weird for lots of reasons and got picked on. And even in my own family was, the butt of all of the jokes. And so I think the Goonies gave me permission to be a reject. Took me a while to learn the lesson, but
Mhm.
and so I don't walk around talking about myself as a reject, but
Are you a millennial or a Gen
I'm
X?
Gen X, like at
Oh,
the end
like
of it.
78, 79, something like
78, yeah, yeah.
that.
So that weird world.
Goonies is a big movie for Gen Xers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Portland last weekend doing poetry and preaching for a church out there. And I realized that I was like an hour and a half from Astoria. And so I got a red eye flight home so that I could have a whole day to just go to the coast. I went to all of the Goonie sites and the museum.
Oh,
And
you are a true nerd.
it was a childhood dream come true. And that's where I realized that, like, yeah, Goonies gave me permission to just be weird and be myself.
Okay, so my last question for
Yeah.
you is how would you describe your life today?
Everything and nothing like I thought it would be.
Yeah, girl, I got you there.
Yeah. No, I think I'm on this adventure of
Yeah, I consider my life an adventure too.
just being authentic, living into my creativity, and like just I'm not certain about many things, and I'm okay with that. Like I'm just open to learning and to growing and to just there's moments when life is hard, but I'm really enjoying being alive and I'm grateful that I am.
Mhm.
And I'm really, really grateful that I didn't listen to the people who told me to wait. Because the
Or
longer I
told
waited, the more I wasn't going to do it.
well, yeah, told you to, or you moved somewhere so you could be ordained. I mean,
Yeah.
I think if you had chosen that path, you probably would be an out lesbian minister somewhere. in the West Coast. But this opens up so much more possibilities than church world.
Oh,
It
yeah.
really does, that
Yeah.
you're doing now.
Yeah.
So, how can people find you? If people want to work with you, or if they want to have you come to their church, how can they find
Yeah.
you?
So I have a website, 10 Camels, the number 10, 10camels.com. You can find all things there. I am on like Facebook and Instagram, but that's not where the best of me is found. But on the website, and then I write every Wednesday on Substack, something called Wednesdays at the Well.
Mhm.
And I share reflections on the things that cause and quench our thirst. And sometimes they're more spiritual or faith-based. Sometimes they're more about creativity or just everyday things. But I'm also in the process of revising my second manuscript to send to the publisher. So anticipate having another book coming out in 2026.
Poetry?
Yes, another book of poetry.
Yeah.
And yeah, I love traveling around and speaking to churches and to groups of people that are just want to hear a good story, but also want some inspiration to start telling their own.
Well, thank you so much for coming
Yeah.
on the show today, Rebecca. It's so nice to meet you. We have a
Yeah.
lot in common.
Yeah.
Thank you again. I
Yeah.
really
No, thank
appreciate
you
it.
so much.
You've been listening to Coming Out and Beyond LGBTQIA plus stories with Anne-Marie Zanzal. New episodes of the Coming Out and Beyond podcast drop every other Friday. You can tune in at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and at annemariezanzal.com. Be sure to hit subscribe when tuning in so you never miss an episode. And for more resources, articles, videos, and a free downloadable guide for coming out later in life, visit annemariezanzal.com.